Thank you for coming, everyone. So this panel is going to talk, it's going to be a few different things, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm personally trying to do to help preserve games, specifically indie games, but also what the developers can do to help us preserve things, knowing that there is a whole host of historians, many of whom are in the audience today, who would love to be able to use your resources, but they're just not available. So we want to make those things available, but also a little bit about what fans can do to help. So let's get started. So my name's Andrew Borman. I'm the digital games curator at the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. I'll talk a little bit about what that is in a few minutes, but really what I'm working to do there is I'm helping to preserve the history of electronic games, and really with a focus on digital titles, be it big AAA titles or indie games. I help design exhibits, which is one way of getting this sort of material out in front of the public. And I'm also a former school librarian, so I had a lot of fun working with kids and figuring out what they were playing. My big area of interest is unreleased games. So you can see a picture of the unreleased Gremlins arcade game, a VHS of that in the middle. But that's a topic for a different day. So first up is Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff Mostyn. I am fresh out of college, professional software engineer. I'm also a team lead and programmer at Pharaohhound Games. I'm in the studio exhibiting today, and we're making a game called Sons of Ra, which is a competitive tower defense thing.
And that may be a common descriptor for indie games. It's a thing, and it's fun.
A mishmash of mechanics somehow works together.
So Luigi, you're up next.
Yeah, so
We'll let you ask this one, but then we're going to hold off until the end. Okay, we'll hold off till the end.
all right, so I'm Luigi. I'm an indie dev, but also a software engineer as well. I've worked with the museum to help archive some analog-related items, but also I help build some of the interactive exhibits there when I'm not creating the last apps.
Joe?
I'm Joe Kreyling. I've been making indie video games for the past 5 years. Before that, I was a web developer and manager at nonprofits, and I am not fresh out of college or fresh out of anything.
You'll see that I've tried to have a variety of people up here. So, and Tim?
I am Tim Robinson. I am a project manager, a producer, a designer, and more.
Aren't we all?
Yeah. Many hats when you do indie games. I previously worked on Pixel Noir, and I have a booth for Owns and Master in the MIVS section. It's booth 50. Come check it out.
Oh, you're way better at that than I was.
It's basically Overcooked set in like a Spirited Away kind of world. So it's come run a bathhouse at our booth.
So I want to give a quick introduction about the Strong Museum. I did a whole big panel last year, and I know one of my colleagues, Shannon, has done one in the past as well, but I still wanted to give some sort of description here. So we're home of the most comprehensive collection of material related to the study of play. That ranges everything from toys, dolls, action figures, to, of course, video games being one of the most popular ways of playing in the 21st century. As of a few days ago, we counted over 550,000 objects at the museum, with over 60,000 of those related to electronic games in some way, shape, or form. And that's counting things that kind of predate video games a little bit. And that also doesn't count our archival material, which ranges everything from the notebooks from Will Wright. We have stuff from Microsoft. Carol Shaw is another one. We have what was left of the Atari coin-op division when they shut down. And that really encompasses both games and hardware, promo material, source code, documents, a little bit of everything. You can look at the past MAGFest panels if you'd like to hear more about that. But one of the things that we kind of identified is that indie games are very underrepresented at the museum right now. So my own personal bias is really that I play games that at least I would call indie games, probably more than just about any sort of game out there. A lot of times they're shorter, I have less time than I used to have, but they're also just really fun and really creative. What I see as being important to indie games is technology has really come back around, and it's allowed us to distribute games in a much wider way than was possible in the past. We're not talking about having to do mail order catalogs all the time, which was a popular way to order indie games in the past. But it also has open game development in a lot of ways. You don't necessarily have to be this crazy programmer to make a game anymore. And I think that's really fun. But millions and millions of games have been sold that you would define as indie in some way. Both ones that are influenced by the big name titles that are out there, but also indie games that give back to those big name titles in some way. But you can see I'm kind of dancing around what's going to be the first major question that I'm going to involve with the panelists here, and that is, what is an indie game? We want to start at the end with Luigi. What do you think an indie game is?
For me, it's more of a, I wouldn't say smaller team, but a team that has creative freedom without having to worry about people changing their idea because that's what they need to sell, that's what they need to produce at the end of it, or cut certain mechanics that because it's not going to make a deadline. But obviously, as indie devs, we do need deadlines and all that fun stuff. But for me, the big thing about what indie game is having that pure creative freedom to kind of express your opinion as well as your team's opinion and thoughts and ideas.
Sure, Jeff.
That's difficult.
It is a difficult question.
I mean, definition-wise, it's a studio not owned by or a game made by a studio not owned by a publisher,
Sure.
objectively speaking. But then there's the gray area of Studio MDHR, Cuphead, or were they indie when they published? They're working, working with Microsoft now. It's I feel like it's almost like a question like, what's an anime versus what's a cartoon? It's what is perceived as to people who are playing it largely, I think, is what determines if a game's an indie game or not. But generally, I'd say it's smaller team,
Joe?
the creative freedom, things like that.
Yeah, I'll fight you on both of those because I am both a developer and a publisher, and so our publisher support that we can extend is not so much like money in terms of buying people time, though we do cut small advances to creative teams when we can, but we also provide 100% of the development and 100% of the post-launch support for all of our games, which are mostly visual novels, but our latest game has a lot more mechanics, and it was much more difficult to build between two people. It was me and my husband. I think, to me, an indie game is a game where the bugs are charming as opposed to irritating. Honestly, we're on the verge of Microsoft launching a quadruple A studio, and I often jealously look at indie game developers that have the support of what I call major indie publishers, which is support that my teams will never have access to. So, when I say indie, I think I mean hungry.
Okay.
Similar to what some of them have said, I tend to look at it as smaller teams, unrestricted creativity on what you're working on. It's interesting when you get into the publisher side of things, because we have a publisher for Onsen Master now, but it seems like publishers used to have some sort of we give you money, you give us game sort of relationship all the time. But now the publisher for Onsen is similar to what you do, where we're making the game and they're supporting us in other ways. They're supporting us via marketing, and they're supporting us through distribution. They're going to help us get onto Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft. They're going to handle those relations for us. So we get to just focus on making the game. We still own our IP. We don't have any sort of restriction whatsoever. We have an agreement to make them a game, and they will support it, and then we'll split some sort of back end costs. So at the end of the day, it comes down to indies are just basically unrestricted studios that are typically smaller.
Okay. Okay. One question I'll allow.
So, several terms you use leave open to needing definition. What do you define as a studio? What do you define as a team? Without understanding what you perceive these to mean, a lot of your responses aren't making that part fully understood.
So I'm actually going to agree with you to a certain extent, but I want to give a quick update because my answer is very different as not being a game developer at all. I can't program anything. I can't program a Hello World, really. So I'm perhaps in this really odd spot. So my cop-out answer is it incorporates everything that they've said. It incorporates everything else that maybe somebody else would say. Everybody's going to have this own definition of what an indie game is. And now I've read quite a few books, especially from the academic world, of where we're trying to define what is indie, what is a studio, what do all these things mean. And really for me, how we classify these things, for my purposes, is I'm just trying to do it in a way that makes it more findable for everybody else. Whether it's an indie game, whether it's a Microsoft game, that doesn't actually matter of whether it should be at the museum or not. So all of those things belong. And really the interpretation part of it is all this, what is a studio, what is all this other stuff, that can actually come at a later point for my purposes, that I want to make this information just available to researchers. Somebody might call some of the games that are up here right now indie, some of them might not, but they're going to be available for whoever is doing research, and I think that's what's important. So I want to just talk about what we've collected so far and how I've done it at the museum. So I went to the independent games, oh, that went too far. You'd think that it'd scroll down, but that doesn't always work how it's supposed to. I went to the list of Independent Game Festival Award winners and those that were nominated for things just as a logical starting point. I didn't see that as the definition of what an indie game is, but you have to start somewhere. From there, I started to look online to really see what materials were out there for indie games. One of the things that I really love is that indie game developers are generally really open with the things that they've made. So I've been able to find things like source code just lying around on the internet. Will you be able to find them in 10 years is a different story. From there, I wanted to build relationships with the developers themselves, because even though things are on the internet, that is only kind of a potential step for things being preserved. Preservation really needs to be this hands-on process of making sure that it's not just accessible now. What happens when the website goes down? Where do we go from there? I want to make those things accessible for a long, long time to come. And since then, you know, it's really expanded quite a bit. These are three major collections that we have: Wild Earth, Quadrilateral Cowboy, Crayon Physics Deluxe. Maybe you recognize one of these, maybe you don't, but they've all won awards. And they're just starting points. We have other games, we have independent games, where there's things that we've downloaded, we have things that we've bought, things that we've worked with other companies, but they haven't really given us. These are big collections with things that you won't necessarily just find on the internet. But with all of this, as great as indie games are, as great as the developers are in opening things up, there's a lot of problems that come with trying to preserve indie games. Now, not all of these problems are going to be unique to indie developers. Big name developers have many of the same issues, and many others, quite honestly. But they also have different ways of solving them. So yes, we're going to talk about problems today, but we also want to talk about a little bit about how we're going to get to some potential solutions to finding these things. Being that teams, all of you have said the teams are generally quite a bit smaller. That means you can do certain things that a big team can't, but you also don't have the manpower to do certain things that those big teams can do. So let's move things along. I want to jump into one of the first topics, and we're going to jump towards the end-ish of game development and selling your game. There are probably thousands of digital storefronts online. At the most basic level, at the museum, I want to be able to play your game in the future. With any luck, I can go out and buy a physical version of the game, but let's face it, that likely isn't going to happen for many indie games that are being made. So my question to you is just one of, what storefronts have all of your games been released on, if they've been released, or if you're still working on it, have you gone to someplace like Kickstarter or Indiegogo or something like that to try to get the word out there to get people hopefully giving you money in some way, shape, or form? We'll start down at this end.
Oh, no. Pixel Noir is on Steam right now in an early access format, and Onsen Master will eventually be on there too. Both of those games will be coming to consoles. But one of the unique things we did, because we have a few outliers of people that are very concerned about this,
Yep.
Especially on Kickstarter, there's always 2 or 3 that are like, can I have a certain kind of build somehow?
Yep.
And I tell them, yeah, if it's small enough, thankfully, we're not a huge company or anything. If somebody emails me and goes, can you just send me an EXE? I'll be like, sure, let me whip one up for you. That way, if you are concerned about Gabe Newell dying and taking Valve down with him in Steam, that, you know, you can have a copy of the game where you'll always have it. It doesn't matter if it's on a distribution platform or not, because that is something that I think in the back of our heads, a lot of us are like,
Right.
what about my game library?
Just casually describing a games apocalypse.
It's what I'm preparing for. That's my job. So.
So, just for a little bit of context, my games are 5 out of 7 of the games that I've published and developed in the last 7 years, or 5 years, have come out on Steam, and we usually co-release on itch.io because it's not a huge pain. But just as a statistic for those of you in the room, in 2017, 16,000 games released on Steam.com or SteamPowered.com, and it's just a lot of games. In my first 2 games was coded in a proprietary engine that my husband wrote himself and were released on a website called datenighto.com. They are, you know, not only available there, we've put binaries out on itch.io, but for I think the first 3 years they were exclusively available on a website that was only like released by us and maintained by us.
We are still in development, so
Right.
nothing is, well, that's not true. We have a demo version of our game available for download on itch.io, linked through our website. We have a Steam page upon which you can wishlist us, but nothing is available for download as of yet. And we will be launching on Steam and on Xbox One through ID at Xbox.
Cool.
That's the general synopsis, I guess. Not a whole lot.
Sure.
And then on my end, it's all through Steam. Like, I use Itch and I use Humble, but it's to get Steam codes. So that leads you straight back to Steam. And then even before that, though, before we went to early access, I just sent out links to a Dropbox to my testers. So there's all these builds everywhere that I'm not sure where there are anymore.
Nightmare.
But that used to be the thing where I just post a link on our Discord and then all of our testers would just download it straight from there before we went on Steam. So that's kind of the distribution of our pre-release there was just have at it. Use the XE. I don't know which one you have. I don't know what you're gonna get, but
Yep.
here's something.
Yeah, we betaed through itch, and the client never worked for our other team
No.
That's
members.
the
And
thing. It's like going through some of the clients. We tried to get an EXE for Itch, and it's just a little too difficult.
Yeah.
A little too to get everything set up. Like it's set up now, but still too many steps in the process that Steam's a lot easier to deal with. So I kind of stopped doing Itch EXEs essentially for their storefront just because it was a little bit more harder.
Well, I heard a few things in here. One was an issue of discoverability with, 16,000 or whatever games released on Steam. My issue is between Steam itself and all these other storefronts, how the heck am I going to find the games that you're releasing? That's one of the big issues that I run into. Like, yes, both the other curator, Shannon, and myself, we can play a lot of games in a given year, but that's going to touch a fraction of what's out there, let alone the fact, if you're distributing it on itch sometimes, maybe it's through Dropbox other times, there's all these different things where if I was trying to keep track of that to preserve these games now, because that's the big thing with digital is we need to do this now and not 100 years from now, which we'll talk about, there is not a chance that I'm going to find any of this stuff. So that's why I like having people up here. So one of the reasons I bring this up is because there was an issue where, well, let me pose a different question, really. Have any of your storefronts disappeared so far?
our website goes down a lot. Sometimes the certs expire and we don't notice for days. That's a little rough sometimes. None of our games have been disappeared, despite the fact that one of my games is a gay porn game. So plus itch for having more lax standards about that and more generous kind of like. A lot of our audience, because of the games that we've made, including We Know the Devil and Heaven Will Be Mine, are gay friendly. Yep. So a lot of our gay audience goes to itch specifically to buy games. So like the more like kind of adults only topics, like we can explore more there. Steam has loosened up because they like money, so I don't know where I'm going with that, but none of our games have been disappeared except for one. My husband made a game which is only available via piracy now because an unnamed Japanese company pulled the IP, and it is only piratable. It is called Namco High, and it is a dating sim of Namco characters. And it was made by an enormous ensemble art team. An incredible amount of effort was put into it. He is under NDA to not talk about that.
We'll talk about NDAs and all that stuff.
So you're saying I could date Pac-Man?
Yes,
God.
Pac-Man was a dateable character. Prince was a dateable character for a while. We had the only Homestuck character that was playable in a video game until Andrew Hussey released his games with What Pumpkin. And that game is gone from the internet, 100%.
How do you get this in your museum?
That's the big thing. So one instance that I was going to bring up is there is a Wii U developer. Wii U eShop, I think, is still open. The Wii one has closed down. But for whatever reason, his game was going to be pulled from the eShop within days. So luckily, he happened to post it on Twitter. And I think my next day at work was like a week away because it was a holiday or something. I went into work that day because he was able to send us codes. We were able to download them onto the Wii U. And they're there for now, which we'll talk about closed ecosystems here in a second. But we're not allowed to pirate things, which is a big issue for games that have already been disappeared in some way, shape, or form. So that's why if we can talk to developers if they haven't signed NDAs, which we'll also talk about, that's great. But there is a huge issue with things disappearing. One benefit, though, is that indie game developers tend to use less DRM than other companies would. Benefit for me, maybe not a benefit for all of you on the stage, but at least, theoretically, even once I've been able to buy it or obtain it, I can keep that going for a much longer period of time. The issue is not everything is as easy as going to a website and hitting download. There's closed ecosystems, so we're kind of at the mercy of the various app stores and their own availability. I was a big Windows Phone fan. I'm sorry. I know Frank is out there somewhere, and he made a Windows Phone game.
There's two of you?
There's multiple. So Windows Phone, I liked it, but most people didn't. It's now gone. Apple, we're going to talk about removing some support both for the ecosystem and the operating system, which is a huge issue. For Google platforms, which are relatively open, if I want to download the game, it's okay, that's easy, but what phone am I talking about? What sort of platform? What sort of other services? Because Google links their Google services to everything. It's a whole nightmare. How about the Ouya?
How about it?
How about it? Yep. I mentioned the Wii.
No.
The original Xbox Live, that's gone for now. Stay tuned for that. All of that is gone. So yes, as a museum, we're actually allowed to jailbreak things, which is great. We're allowed to jailbreak our phones, our consoles, but how we're doing that isn't always clear because it's a Digital Millennium Copyright Act exemption, but it's not clear if that tool is being used to pirate things online by the general public. Is a museum still allowed to use that very same tool? Unfortunately, it's not very clear. But I do want to go back to the topic specifically of Apple, because Apple has become kind of famous for removing support for things over the years, whether it's when they removed PowerPC support, even though they wrote their emulator that was compatible with Intel processors, 32-bit support, iPhone, old iOS versions, suddenly you can't play all the old apps. Really, Apple has made an apocalypse by killing many games. I know, Joe, you have a very personal story with this one as well.
We actually just got our first customer complaint yesterday about a Catalina user.
Yes, I mean, no.
Not being able to play We Know the Devil, which was sad because we built our demo in Unity and it is perfectly playable in Catalina. Catalina is the newest version of Mac OS and does no longer supports 32-bit games. Our game is merely 4 years old at this point and is no longer under Apple's tender care. we are going through the difficult discussion of deciding if we need to bring in our old code and port the game to Unity. And it's kind of sad because we are so proud of our baby, our proprietary engine, and Unity is a monolith, and yet we kind of depend on it because it has ongoing support and a vibrant, developer environment. A bunch of people use Unity, and hopefully it will be developed for all time. Just the engine support that we have with Unity will save We Know the Devil for future users, and yet kind of removing its original charm where we had it built line by line in a weird XML that we made up ourselves is gonna be lost when we bring the game over.
Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars was ported, I think it was the PSP version of it, maybe got ported to the iPhone years and years and years ago. It's an old game now. But as the iPhones went on, it wouldn't work anymore. You could still download it, but it just wouldn't function. And then they updated it this year, and I was like, I actually just re-downloaded it because I was fascinated. I was like, oh, cool, I can play this game again. However, it works on a certain size iPhones. Now that they have a few different phones, screen sizes, you can't actually play it properly on certain screen sizes now too, which is a fascinating conundrum. Because how do these companies, they have to spend money to go in and redo these things and update them if they want. And is there you're basically just saying, do we spend this money to cater to this audience that's now 10 years old and maybe 40 people play it?
Right.
So I think it's just a really weird and fascinating
right.
world we're going into.
And Rockstar is a big one who has updated their games quite a bit over the years, but it wasn't just to update it to actually work on a new platform. They've removed things, they've changed things. Their Grand Theft Auto Anniversary Edition, they're famous for removing music because they lose the license.
Yeah.
There's all these issues of versions that we're not really going to get into a lot of detail, but I think, Joe, you're kind of bringing that up anyway, of even if you upgrade this, it's not necessarily going to be the same game. And that's an issue that's going to be a discussion that we have for many years. And one of the practical reasons that we will struggle at the museum is we don't have an infinite amount of data storage. None of us do, whether it's the museum. Internet Archive probably has the most internet storage out of any of us, but there is limits to all of that. But I want to get into really the process of making your game. One of the things that we've been lucky about with game history is generally because the digital tools weren't developed at the time and the computers weren't that great, we had a lot of developers making things on paper. That has allowed us to go back 30 years later, recover the paper, often with source code because they had to print it out for one reason or another. And we've been able to recover things like Carol Shaw's source code for River Raid, which was huge. And I know, again, multiple people in the room have used it. But digital games have their own issues because now we have digital tools that can be used to pretty much exclusively make your game. Are any of you making anything on paper anymore?
It's not me. Our artists occasionally, we have like two sort of artists on it. And we have a UI guy and we have a general 3D, some 2D art guy. And the 2D, 3D art guy will make sketches on paper for certain things.
Okay.
And then usually send that to us, via some picture or something. So I'm sure if we looked hard enough, we might have like 10 to 12 pages of physical sketches and concept art in his varied notebooks and such.
Which, again, great resources to have, but that's not a whole lot. Anybody else want to chime in?
I'm obsessed with making what I call a paper build.
Okay.
I don't know if that's like an official term or not, but both games that I've worked on now, I've sat down with certain things like a battle system or Mostyn Master. I turned into an actual board game one night. Like in one night, I sat down and just like went to Illustrator and went, yes, this is it. This is the game. To make some sort of tangibility out of it, mainly to help the team sit down and look at it and try to understand from a systems level in a new way, because it's difficult when you're making a game sometimes to explain your idea out to people. If you're not the coder or the artist, and it's hard for you to physically be like, this is how the idea works, sometimes making it into some sort of little paper thing and sitting down with people and walking them through it helps them play it and get everybody on the same page together.
Yep.
And a lot of that stuff I've saved. And then design documentation everywhere.
Yep.
All of the tasking, every individual task that gets put out to a team member gets archived as well.
Cool.
So that we can print it out and look at it and review it and do postmortems and things. Mainly so that somebody like you who might be interested in a production pipeline of a title, like if my game becomes a classic somehow, it's not ever going to be.
But the next one you do
The
probably
next
will
one,
be.
absolutely,
Totally.
100%. Kickstarter 2021. Somebody could actually ask me, "Hey, how did this go?"
Yeah.
And I can say, "Let me show you challenges month by month that we hit, and walk somebody through game design." So hopefully, people can make better games with that information.
And from the historical point of view, it's great the stuff that we do have, but when we lose that sort of documentation in particular, we could often have this range of, okay, we have concept art, design documentation, all this great stuff, and then we go to the end of the game, and it's like magic. It just appeared on the store shelf one day. I know all of you know that that's not the case, but being able to go through step by step is really an important thing. And I know I'm not giving everybody a chance to talk on this one, but I want to talk about some of the digital tools you're using. And have any of you tried to go back to your old stuff, if you have old stuff, and tried to open it, and it has not gone as well as you'd like?
All the time. For us, even like using like GitHub or some kind of repository.
And we'll
it's
talk
like
about that.
Figuring out what version was this on, or like even like using like Unity, like tools like Unity. It's like, okay, what friggin' version of Unity did I use? Was it 5?
Yep.
Was it 2018? What was it? And then trying to figure out, okay, how to download this. And then sometimes they don't have the right version because they have a long-term support version that is the official version. And so there's a whole bunch of issues that I've come across is like finding the right version of the software that I need to open up an old project. But then there's also the side of it that I don't write anything down on paper. We print things and then write on that, and then that subsequently gets lost somewhere. Or we take a picture of a whiteboard, and then it goes in the cloud. So as far as paper trails, it's nothing for us. But again, it goes back to we get into the scenarios. Okay, where did we put this? What do we use? Dropbox? Do we use Google Cloud?
Right.
Where do we put this thing? And so that's kind of the issue that I face a lot is that aspect of it.
Where is it?
Yeah, we're also, we're Google Drive people, so a lot of my development notes are in just unorderly tables and various Google documents hidden like via search. They're only searchable now because they all say final, actually final on them.
You people are monsters.
I also do a lot of paper design work because I found that if you show a developer a digital sketch, he will ask you what is implementable immediately. And if you show them something drawn on pencil, they won't ask any questions about how anything works. The imagination will flow. But yeah, we ended up using a combination of GitHub, found that writers and artists don't use GitHub, then use Google Docs and calendars. Just calendar lineups are super important to us to be able to develop anything.
Jira. If Jira is a project management software, it's $10 a month. It's super cheap compared to a lot of software that you end up getting into in game development, and it is life-saving. Everything can be, I have it open at the booth right now, and as people are playing it, go bug, and I just type it down, and now it's on a list, just a straight list of tasks. And then when we decide to do a sprint, which is, we do a series of tasks over a week or 2 or 3 or a month, I can just grab that task and drag it and drop it into the sprint, and I go, you're working on that this week. And then it actually, when you hit go, it puts it into a visual board where you can drag it from the task to in progress to finish your QA or whatever you want. You can customize the whole thing. There's also another program that's called Confluence that is a documentation platform built within that software that is another $10 a month though, sadly. But you can do all of your documentation in there for designs, whatever. and link it into the task itself dynamically. So if somebody on your team is a designer and they said, this is how you shoot the monster, then you can link it to the shoot the monster coding task. And then that person, when they're working on it, they go, what is this? And then they go, oh, there's a document here with images and everything. And it just like saves lives having it all organized.
So this stuff is all awesome because it really feeds into the next big thing. And I'm sorry for cutting you off, but I'm trying to be conscious
We're
of
doing
the time.
like 8 sub-panels at once.
Exactly. So it's a very quick overview so I can learn a lot, but also hopefully this next question causes you to think a little bit. But all these things, whether it's $10 a month, whether it's Google Drive, all things that I've used, what's your exit plan for all of this stuff? What happens when that disappears? How are you going to export that, get it into something else? Because this comes from experience because I've had the real pleasure of trying to recover source code and all these materials for programs that the developers never bothered documenting it, or the documentation is inside of those repositories that I currently can't access because they didn't create documentation. So I hope nobody is using SourceSafe anymore because that's been deprecated a long time ago. But a program like Perforce, still being used by a lot of big developers to do source control, art repository control, that's great if you have licensed software and can access it. I've had to set up basically an old server using licenses that expired 13 years ago that were hard-coded to specific hardware using IP addresses that were also hard-coded. All of this mess of stuff just to get to it. Yes, I can convert from Perforce to GitHub or something relatively easily, but there's always something lost along the way if you don't have an exit plan before that. So, what's your exit plan? If I want to be able to access this, how would I access it?
I have a question for you after that.
Okay.
I mean, when you first posed that question, my answer was denial. We have not thought about that whatsoever.
That's not uncommon, don't feel bad.
After hearing, like, your relative organization just expose the steaming, flaming train wreck that ours is.
If any of you want to learn, just hit me up. I'll tell you everything.
We know a best practice, we just don't do them.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Now, like, most of our stuff is, we have Google Drive is probably the best answer. And you can download that, I guess.
Right.
But even then, there's
my
very
login.
little in the way of actual organization. Things are everywhere and nowhere. We've had conversations, and I've tried to go back to find where we wrote certain things down, and they just...
They're not there. What's funny though is sometimes a zip document, not a zip drive like I have up here. I do have one up here just as a joke because we've recovered from that too, and I know Frank has experience with that too. They're actually easy compared to other stuff. But if a zip file is sometimes easier to recover than some of these other things. But go ahead, somebody else who wants to chime in.
All of my digital files go into a big folder called completed projects where they're lost forever. Like,
Where you put them on a zip drive. Forget about them.
Same thing over here, and at some point I end up like cleaning out some of my Google Drive stuff and be like, I don't need this file anymore, and then poof, it's gone.
I haven't finished anything yet, so but the plan has been to do basically what they're doing is to have a completed folder somewhere and be like, this is the project, and put it somewhere digitally that's safe and sound. And then that way it's recoverable if need be, if you need to dip back into it. But I was wondering what you want us to do as developers. What helps a museum?
Anything that doesn't require licenses and that you can document that says, here's the hardware that I used to access it, here's how I set it up. If you have a virtual machine that you can back up and say, like, here's your build server, that's awesome. That very rarely exists. And we've talked to companies, big companies who I won't name, they don't often have that stuff. That would be the perfect world, but nobody's doing that, let's be honest. But if you have any of those, anything that is easily accessible using a virtual machine, even if I have to make it, or, and I know a few people will probably ask more about this, but anything that I don't have to do all this hacky stuff of trying to come up with licenses.
So like version number of the software, version number of the operating system.
That helps. Yeah, absolutely.
Like that.
And if there are any of these odd cases where, I need Unity version 3. Whatever,
You
just
will.
make it. I know.
You will.
Oh yeah.
Just make note of it and back up all that stuff now while you're doing it. Have that be part of your Google Drive backup, even if that's all you're using. If you need Unity, whatever, to build it, back that up now, because that's probably going to disappear, and then you're going to have to go to the piracy sites to try to recover these things.
To date Pac-Man.
Right, exactly. So you just don't know. Do all that stuff now. I know it's a lot of work. It will help you in the future, especially as we're getting to this point where who knows how long Microsoft is going to continue to support things how they are. You know, they're moving to ARM processors in a lot of ways. Apple has already shown that they have no problem cutting off the legs or arms of their own software. Just back it all up now.
Has their
Google.
graveyard.
Yeah, Google. I mean, there's a whole website out there to track dead Google projects if you want to see those.
How long do you think till Stadia ends up there?
We'll talk about Stadia privately later. But all of those things are going to be important, especially knowing that Google Drive is really cheap. You know, it's easy to access, it's easy to set up, whether it's on a NAS or you're just backing up your own computer. Whatever you're doing, do it in a way that you can manage it. That is the other key part of it. All the fanciest software in the world means nothing if you're not using it. So do it in a way that you can maintain until the end of time or until you're done with it. We've talked a little bit about Unity, but are there any tools, by the way, I'm going to go back a few slides. If you know what game that is on the right, let me know afterwards. I know one person in the audience does. It's very hard to see.
Vampire Rain.
No, it's not. It's a wireframe image.
Oh.
I know, Kelsey, you know what this is, but that's besides the point. Creating your game, your tools, we've talked a little bit about migration. Are there any tools that you're currently worried about that are going to be a lot of trouble in the future? Whether it's 3D Studio Max has been generally supported, other than the plugins that are being designed for it. Anything that you're worried about other than Unity? Just Unity.
Honestly, like when people ask me like about game development careers, and especially a lot of younger developers kind of say, "I'm building my own engine." That's what worries me the most.
Okay.
Because there's Unity will lose stuff for you and on your behalf, and versioning will screw you over. But there's nothing as easily lost as an engine that you make and maintain yourself. Like I can think of games that have dwindled into dust before they could even be games because of an abandoned engine that were perfectly lovely games when they existed on their own. There's like just like the hollow eyes of someone saying, "Don't make the mistakes we made." But it's just harder and harder to imagine kind of preserving our old engine, like in the face of something that at least has year-to-year support, and in Unity's case, like quarterly updates.
So I'm going to skip ahead. I want to know all your secrets right now. One of the biggest issues I've run into is the issue of NDAs, whether you're working with a publisher or not, working with these companies, working with Nintendo, even the person that I mentioned before with the Wii U games. He was afraid to send me anything more because they were using Nintendo copyrighted libraries and that sort of thing. That's going to be the one thing of how comfortable you get over the years. And I don't know if you even need to chime in for any of this, but you know, all those things that you have to take into consideration. I don't know what agreements are made with Unity. I don't know, you don't want to leak something on Steam. You don't want to do any of this stuff. How are you if you want to, how are you trying to protect yourself in a way that, if you wanted to give us stuff someday or share anything with somebody, are you taking into consideration all this NDA fun stuff?
It's not quite NDA, but legal contract stuff of, as I mentioned, I'm a recent grad. My team, we met in college. We started our game as a class project. People who were in class and worked on our game with us are no longer on the team because they chose not to or whatever circumstances led to them leaving. Well, theoretically, if we're in somewhat of a legal hell because until we get agreements to everybody who was on the game, if something happens, say we make a lot of money or get crazy popular or something, one of them could be like, "Hey, I worked on that. I'm not getting anything."
Right.
Even if they fully just said, "Yeah, I don't want to work on this anymore,"
That is a definitely huge issue, especially I hope all of you become rich someday and help support us.
I mean, even like, anyone in particular vindictive would probably make you, take something down, get rid of it, poof, gone, because they weren't credited and they thought they should have been.
Right. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in on this one, but it's one of those things. I want to make sure that you're thinking about that. I know there's a lot of different issues. And what I'll say is, as a museum, and this is something that can differentiate us between, the Internet Archive, is that we're not going to upload your stuff to the internet. Unless you want us to. If you want to sign over the rights to whatever you made, feel free. I mean, it doesn't happen, but we're happy to work with you if that's the case. But all this stuff is available on-site for researchers only. What on-site means is possible to change in the future, especially as we look at things like virtual reading rooms. But keep in mind, as you're working with a museum, and I know Luigi has probably worked with a museum the most out of anybody, we're going to try do our best to protect you. We're making sure you're not signing over your rights unless you want to. Just a quick thing, because I want to get to questions from the audience, because I know they are going to want to ask something. The Indie Arcade downstairs is awesome. One of the realities of being at a museum is there's only so much physical space. Luckily, we're in Rochester, which means we're not stuck with New York City style storage units or anything else. But I would love to preserve everything, including Scoop Pooch, which is down there. And I have a lot of fun with that game.
The dog.
Yeah, that's the dog game. We'll talk about that later.
God.
But I love it, but we can't physically save everything. Now, Luigi has helped us design interactives similar to the one on the right. That one's actually made by a different Rochester group, sorry. But I don't think you're really designing the physical aspects of anything. You're doing mostly software, right?
Software. But even, I've been in the archives.
Right.
I've been in the basements. And it's amazing how much space everything takes up that you guys have outside of the video games. Even all the puzzles and dolls that you have, it's just massive warehouses just underground of stuff.
Yep.
You don't have a lot of space. I mean, with the upcoming
expansion, we'll get new space, but that will run out eventually.
Exactly. So it's with the arcade, I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about this, but I've been told I can't. The arcades and the pinball areas.
We have over 300 of them. So
and they're just literally either crammed or stacked next to each other.
Safely, mind you, but
safely protected.
As close as you can possibly get, because every inch matters when you're talking about, a 6x4 cabinet.
It's how do you expand on that? How do we get more stuff in there
Right.
that we won't break? And then again, who's gonna fix it?
Like a game like Killer Queen, which is great. I don't know if you guys would consider that indie or not anymore, because they do fairly decently and have published their game on other stuff. Game is gigantic. It is practically 1,000 pounds, something like that. For us, there's not that much benefit to having that. No researcher is asking us for it, but that's something that we have to keep in mind from a practical standpoint of how we can preserve those things. So we touched on a lot of things, whether it's the creative freedom that being indie gives you, keeping track of things and how we're not keeping track of things. I have confirmation now that paper isn't really being used by most of you, which is scary.
I didn't get to answer. I like paper.
Good.
That's a producer thing.
But I want to give everybody else that's out here, because we have quite a few researchers here on the Mages panel. I'm trying to gather stuff that ultimately they're going to be the ones that are using. What is it that you're finding when you're going through, whether it's our archives, the stuff at the Video Game History Foundation, wherever you're looking, what is it that we're missing still that you would like to see? Carly.
I love storyboards, and I've only come across 2 ever for games, and they're great. They're super fun, and those sketches and things are where people make a note. You're in a meeting and you're scribble something. You're no, it should work like this. That's so fascinating because I get to see what didn't get made. Right. And so the game that's finished is interesting, but I would also say I know when you mentioned oh, my game's not gonna be a big classic. I don't care. Right. A lot of what's happening is interesting because we're interested in the work processes and the culture of the industry and things. And the artifacts you produce are going to help us look at that, regardless of whether your game's a big hit or not.
That's one of the reasons why I try to take those pipelines and archive them as best as I can, because I got into I didn't go to school for any of this, and I always thought it was interesting how year after year it's getting easier to make a game. The difficult part is sitting down and figuring out how you actually put together all of those pieces, get a team together and manage them properly and things like that. So I think that those are very valuable for people understanding how games are made.
And one of the reasons why I wanted everybody to be on this panel, so it's not just me talking, especially since I'm not a developer, But we have big school, and I know a few of you have either been to RIT, have family at RIT, whatever it may be. RIT is one of the top video game schools in the country. We have the Eastman Museum right next door, who they're starting to have digital arts music programs. It's great to have access to either classic games, which we have tons of material for, or even some modern games and some big things that we're working on, but those are generally AAA style titles. That doesn't really represent what all of you are doing. So
Right. I guess I'll be the bummer here. As a person who's published several flops, I think it's easy to just close the window, like close the door and empty out the folder on a game that just doesn't make the sales. Like from my perspective, as a person who's trying to survive off of a games development lifestyle, it's kind of easy to push aside and not preserve documentation on the games that you just know weren't a hit, because a lack of kind of financial backing usually means a lack of general interest. So some of our games just have not made the cut, and we've genuinely lost a lot of documentation on several of those. Now, whether or not we make a hit in the future and someone wants to study the history of Pillow Fight as a company, that could be a huge loss for them. But for us, it was kind of the case of, if it can't pay the mortgage, it's not worth keeping around and looking at every day.
And what I'll say from a practical point of view for a museum is, don't let organization be the thing that stops you from sending us stuff. We've received, again, pallets worth of material that seems like none of it is organized in any sort of meaningful way. Julia, our archivist, she'll hate me for saying this, but she does such a great job of making sense of what to a lot of us is basically nonsense in some way, shape, or form. She will take care of that in some way, shape, or form to make that a possibility. And the other thing that we didn't talk about is all of your company archives and that sort of thing, all of your communication that you're doing. And there's a lot of privacy issues with that, but keep that in mind as well. Make sure you're saving not just the material for the game, but also for the company that you've founded or making things for. I think that sort of material is equally as interesting to a lot of the people out there doing research. Frank.
So Garrett Bradley at EA did a good talk at GDC last year now, I guess.
He'll name the company I didn't want to name. It's out there now, I know.
About EA. EA has an archive team. There's 5 of them. They're the guys who come knock on the queue when the game's done. They're like cough up the stuff. And he kind of described their top tier archives, where they get things like the Slack readouts.
Yep.
Oh my God. They get things like team photos. They like, and of course, like source code build instructions.
My memes would go archived.
That sounds awesome. And he's giving this talk, and what I'm thinking in my head is like, dude, I'm on like alpha for the next game. We need to archive it.
Right.
What Andrew was saying earlier, it's like archive it now. Just archive it now, and then you're good. It's like realistically,
It's not easy.
we don't have time.
Yep.
So I'm kind of sitting here thinking, like, well, maybe it's time we recognize that as a labor
Yep.
that needs to be compensated for. And I'm wondering if there might be a path forward for, I don't know if like grant is the word, but for like compensating for labor to ensure that these are archived.
Right, and I almost wonder if there's something that we can do, because Frank is head of the Video Game History Foundation, but if there's things that we can do to help make that process less of a cost issue, materials that we can provide, that maybe it's a checklist at the most basic form, but maybe it is. We've actually talked about sending a physical box to indie game developers and say, throw in the stuff that fans made you. If you made a plush toy to do advertising downstairs, throw it in there, throw some papers in there. I don't know if that sort of thing is helpful, but it's definitely something we're willing to do to help. Is we're willing to do as much of the work, knowing that we're getting paid to do this stuff. Well, Frank will get paid, Kelsey will get paid eventually. We are getting paid to do some of this work. So anything that we can do to help you, we would love to do that. So I don't know if there's anything that.
The question is for the developers on the panel is like, what would it take to get you to sit down and actually like create maybe a hard drive or something that everything's documented, everything's stored in these folders, et cetera. Like when I'm thinking for games I've shipped, it's like a week of full-time labor. That sounds about right.
There's lots and lots and lots in our Discord logs, and I think there's lots and lots and lots that people don't want to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, it might turn into a meme archive.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Not just jokes, but also some like tense creative moments,
right.
which I'm sure researchers would love, and no one who has ever worked on a video game wants shared.
And what I'll say is, if there's something that's so much that you don't want people to see, we do some vetting before we like drop a box in front of the researchers and say, here, have at it. You know, there are times where we say, you know, we can't give you access to this. And that's something that you can control to some extent. You know, if it's big contract things that you don't want people to see, but you want it preserved, tell us that ahead of time, and we can say, you know, give us 20 years, and then it'll be accessible to researchers. But also, again, you know, I understand that stuff is in there. We've dug through Atari messages that are quite interesting. And there's another panel later, I think, that will involve Atari. But that stuff is going to be out there, but we will do our best to protect you as well. So
I think the biggest thing that would help would be some sort of standardization of what a museum would want. And then if they're
and really the tools that would help us really be able to say, we want this in per force or whatever.
like, yeah, because if you guys had some sort of standardized list of, you know, this is what we look for,
Yep.
and then maybe even, like, if there was a grant and there's some way that a studio could get paid quarterly pieces of this grant to do quarterly backups, quarterly archiving,
Yep.
that would be something that I think would help. But standardization makes it, because like he said, you know, it might take a week of work, but that could be a week of work at the end, and that means that things on the in-between could get lost. But if it were a regular thing that was standardized, it might make it easier to take the cognitive load off of developers to say, oh, you know what, I'm gonna put this in the sprint for month 3. We're gonna just back up everything and send it over to those nerds and let them deal with it.
And what's interesting about that is that idea isn't that far off. We already pay researchers to come do research at the museum. I wonder if there is a way of finding funding that's out there that is literally, here, we'll give you X. We're very careful. We don't like to pay for personal papers, but if we can find a way of twisting that in a way that makes sense.
We're paying for labor.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's actually a great recommendation that I'm going to take back immediately and try to pitch that.
And
Yeah.
I also think it's kind of a mindset thing too. It's like looking at my stuff. It's like, it's unreleased. Doesn't matter. It's a flop.
No one cares.
It doesn't matter. Exactly. It's
Right.
one of those things. Like, as a developer, I'm sure all of us have made a lot of prototypes, a
Yep.
lot of
Yeah.
almost let's go down this path with this specific thing that just never sees the light of day. And it's like, again, from my mindset, different from yours, but who cares?
Just
Right.
what you need to do is you need to contact teams and send them a framed photo of yourself to put on their desk to be like,
Think about Andrew.
he cares.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've got like a bunch of questions that developed over this.
We got 2 minutes.
One was, my first question that I wanted to ask at the beginning was, what languages are you using to program games?
Sure.
Unity runs in C# is the short answer. Unreal, C++. Game Maker has its own thing, and various other things have their own things. I think Godot has its own thing.
Everything, basically.
Everything is something. Even like for web games, JavaScript. Even
Yep.
then, you can go further down and Python it. There's so many different things you can use. A lot of things I don't have support anymore, like Python 2. Okay, that's over as of yesterday. 2 days ago? Yes, New Year's, whatever day it is, I don't know anymore. That they no longer are supporting this actually really, really large community.
Yep.
So like, okay, what's gonna happen with all the Python 2 stuff? I don't know.
You're looking at me. I don't have an answer yet. Honestly, my answer is that I've been trying to download some of these tools, or at least making sure that they're available elsewhere. That way people can access them, because it doesn't matter if you're not using them anymore. Somebody out there is using them, and we need to keep these things accessible. We are out of time. I know that was short. It went very quick. Thank you, everybody that's up here. Thank you, everyone that's come.
Thanks, coming at.
Some of us have cards. There's also contact information up here. I'm also going to hang around a little bit.
All 4 of us have booths of mids.
Yes,
too,
please
so
go down there.
downstairs. Please
Play
check out
their
the
games.
section.
I'm booth 50.
34.
1.
Right.